So here's something interesting. You're looking at a country where only 15% of people pay their TV licenses, where municipalities are owed 416 billion rand. That's billion with a B. This is by their own residents. Where universities are collectively chasing 14 billion rand in unpaid student fees. Where the national broadcaster describes itself as a burning platform because people simply refuse to pay for the services that they use almost every other day. Welcome to South Africa, a place where we've accidentally created the world's most chaotic experiment in what happens when an entire society collectively decides, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity, to stop paying for things. What's interesting to note here is that this isn't just about people being stubborn or trying to get free stuff. This is about a country that's caught in an impossible paradox where people genuinely can't afford to pay for services while simultaneously losing faith in institutions that seem to have forgotten how to deliver real value for money. Today, we're going to dive deep into the data behind South Africa's payment crisis. And what you need to understand here is how quickly a society can unravel when the basic contract between citizens and institutions breaks down. So I want us to start at the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, because their situation perfectly captures the madness of what's going on here. The SABC is hemorrhaging money so badly that their own CEO described it as a burning platform. And when you look at the numbers, you'll understand why she's not actually being dramatic. Only 15% of South Africans who should be paying for TV licenses actually do so. Let me repeat that in another way. 85% of people are just not paying for their TV licenses. The evasion rate has jumped from 70% in 2018 to 86% today. These aren't just people who forgot to pay their bills. This is a massive civil disobedience that has reached an unprecedented scale. But here's where it gets really wild. The SABC billed 4.3 billion rand last year, but only collected 800 million rand. They're spending 40 rand out of every 100 rand that they collect just on debt collectors trying to chase people who owe them money. The SABC CEO, Nomsa Chabeli, puts it rather perfectly. Those who pay their SABC TV license pay out of the goodness of their hearts, and that's just the reality that they're in. To fully get what's going on here, you need to understand that when a government institution has to rely on people's goodness rather than an actual enforcement, you know that something has gone seriously and horribly wrong. The legislation here is also outdated because it's tied to owning a physical TV set, while everyone has moved to streaming and mobile. It's like trying to regulate a horse-drawn carriage in the age of Tesla. The SABC has no enforcement mechanism, no garnishee orders, no blacklisting powers, nothing. They're basically asking nicely for you to pay your TV license, and they're hoping that you care enough to pay. Actually, have you ever paid for something that you never use just because you felt you should? Let me know in the comments and let's get going here. Also, do you pay for your TV license? Have you ever paid for TV license? In fact, do you even own a TV? Look, if you think the SABC's problems are bad, wait until you see what's happening with municipal payments. South African municipalities are collectively owed 416 billion rand. This is from March this year. To put that into perspective, that's more than the GDP of entire African countries. Households alone owe 299 billion rand, 72% of the total debt. This also isn't just affecting small towns. We're talking about major metros in complete financial freefall. Take, for instance, the city of Johannesburg. They've launched something that they're calling Project Lukisa, which literally means to fix or sort out. They're doing this to try and chase down 61 billion rand in debt. 61 billion rand. Get that straight. But then when we look at the data, we see that it's not just poor communities that aren't paying. Some of the wealthiest areas are among the worst defaulters. For instance, when you go into Tshwane, Ward 42, which includes the affluent areas of Waterkloof and Monument Park, they owe 756 million rand despite having a population that can definitely afford to pay those rates and taxes. What's interesting here is when you look at the collection rates, because that starts to give us a better story. Municipalities budget for around 85% collection rates, but they're only achieving 63% actual collection. The metros are even worse. They budget for around 87.9%, but they're only collecting around 58.2%. These aren't small gaps, you see. These are systematic failures. And government departments, well, look, they also owe around 24.9 billion rand to municipalities. Even the government isn't paying the government. It's insane. Like, South Africa, honestly, guys. Gauteng schools alone, they owe 262 million rand to their local municipalities. While those same municipalities are basically struggling to provide the most basic of services like water and sanitation. Eskom, well, that's another one. The national power utility is owed 95.4 billion rand by municipalities, up 28% in just 8 months. The worst performing municipalities, they account for more than half of this debt, with Emalahleni municipality leading the pack, not in a good way, because they owe 10 billion rand. When the government stops paying its own bills to the government, what message does that send to ordinary citizens? In fact, I want you to share your thoughts below, because honestly, we are in crisis right now. When we look at the higher education sector, something starts to reveal itself. Perhaps the most heartbreaking of this whole thing in this entire crisis. Universities are owed between 10 to 14 billion rand in unpaid student fees. But unlike municipal services or TV licenses, these are young people's futures that are hanging in the balance. For instance, the University of Witwatersrand, WITS, they're owed 968 million rand. The University of Johannesburg is owed 580 million rand. Durban University of Technology, 960 million rand. Like, I know you can get kind of lost in these numbers, but these aren't just numbers. They represent thousands of students whose certificates are being withheld, whose academic records are frozen, and students who can't graduate despite completing their studies. But universities are trying to help. The University of Cape Town provided 1.7 billion rand in financial assistance in 2021. UJ raised 916 million rand between 2016 and 2020 to try and help 13,900 students. But it's just not enough. In fact, it's unsustainable if you think about it. The universities can't write this debt off because they also need to survive. As Rhodes University spokesperson Veli Somhlope explains, without this income, universities can't maintain infrastructure. They can't attract good staff with competitive salaries, and also they can't expand to serve more students. But students genuinely can't also afford to pay more. The missing middle, students too poor to afford university but also too rich to qualify for government funding, they're trapped in an impossible situation, a rock and a hard place. They're academically capable, they've worked hard, but the financial mathematics just isn't working for them. There's also a role that banks play in this. Because South Africa's big four banks, institutions that are supposed to be the most sophisticated at assessing risk and collecting payments, they're also drowning in bad debt. In the first half of 2024, Absa, First Rand, Nedbank, and Standard Bank, they wrote off 27 billion rands in bad debts. That's just in one quarter. Because this is what happens when an entire economy starts to unravel. People just can't pay for stuff. More than 10.1 million South Africans have impaired credit records. Credit cards that default, these are also rising because middle and upper class consumers are using credit cards just to cover monthly expenses. And this isn't even people trying to get luxury purchases. This is for basic survival. The context here is that the credit loss ratio across banks sits at 1% of all loans that are going bad. Now, in a healthy economy, this number should be much lower. Home loan defaults have deteriorated by 21% year on year, which tells you that even people who could afford houses a few years ago, they can no longer make their payments now. Meanwhile, credit application levels are reaching record highs, while approval rates remain at only 32.2%. Two-thirds of people who apply for credit are generally being rejected because they simply cannot afford additional debt commitments. It's a vicious cycle. People need credit to survive, but they can't get it because they can't afford to pay back what they already owe. When banks stop lending and people stop paying, what does that start to tell us about the health of our economy? Let us know in the comments what your perspective on this is. Even high schools have joined this debt payment war, and they've also started to get a little bit more creative about it. Less than 60% of parents are now paying for school fees on time, with some of Johannesburg's most prominent schools having more than 20 million rand each in outstanding fees. One school is even chasing 30 million rand plus. So what this has meant is that schools are now threatening to blacklist non-paying parents with credit bureaus. They're sending SMS warnings about implications of non-payment. They're following up with letters of demand, and then they're listing parents' names on credit agencies. For instance, TPN Credit Bureau, they report that this tactic is starting to work, with collections improving by almost 88% in some cases. When parents realize that not paying for school fees can affect their ability to get a car, a home loan, suddenly they have the money to pay those fees. They start to prioritize those fees, but this is a tough situation. But we have to admit that we've reached a point where schools need to threaten parents with credit blacklisting to get them to pay for their children's education. This isn't about people trying to get free services, or at least I hope so, because these are parents who genuinely can't afford school fees, but also can't afford to have bad credit. So the question then becomes, should parents then downgrade their children's education, or should they also kind of assess and see that they can't afford currently? I don't know, but maybe you can explain to us in the comments. What's really important to understand here is that we're dealing with two completely different problems that look the same from the outside. On one side, you have people who genuinely don't want to pay because they are there. In places like Waterkloof, Silver Lakes, some of the wealthiest neighborhoods in the country, residents are simply refusing to pay. They're refusing to pay the municipal as well as their tax rates. They're saying, why should I pay for services I'm not actually getting? My street lights don't work, my roads have potholes, my water gets cut, and this happens regularly. Look, a lot of these people are making a calculated decision. These residents have the money, but they've lost faith in institutions. Okay, let's maybe zoom out a little bit. South Africa's payment crisis isn't happening in a vacuum. Around the world, traditional broadcasters, they're seeing a decline in license fee compliance as more people move to streaming platforms. Municipalities everywhere are struggling with aging infrastructure and resistant taxpayers, people that want more. Student debt is a global crisis that affects millions of young people across the globe. But what makes South Africa unique in this case is the speed at which our collapse is happening. We're seeing all these trends accelerated and amplified by our economic inequality. Our institutions are weak, and the legacy of apartheid-era mistrust in government institutions, this thing still persists. The BBC has 80% compliance with TV license payments, while our SABC has 15%. Why? Well, it's not just about service quality, though that does matter. It's about trust, legitimacy, and whether or not citizens believe that their institutions serve their interests. Other countries facing similar economic pressures are watching South Africa very carefully, because if this can happen here, it can pretty much happen anywhere. When people lose faith in institutions and those institutions lose the ability to enforce compliance, the entire system, the whole thing, breaks down, and it happens pretty quickly. The numbers I've shared with you today, the stats and all of the shocking things, these aren't just statistics. They're warning signs. When 85% of people don't pay for TV license, when municipalities owe 400 plus billion, when universities can't collect 14 plus billion in fees, when banks have to write off 27 billion rand per quarter, these aren't isolated problems. These are symptoms of a society that's under incredible stress. And that's what we need to read here. South Africa, we've become an accidental laboratory for what happens when the basic assumptions of modern society start to break down. When people can't afford services, when institutions can't deliver value, when trust collapses completely. The most sobering realization from all of this research is how quickly it's happening. Look, I feel that the real question, where the rubber meets the road here, is whether or not our social contract is broken forever. And even though things that are broken can still be fixed, we need to ask ourselves, how badly do they need to break in order for us to feel that they need to be fixed? The question isn't whether South Africans will start paying for things again. The question is whether our institutions will become worth paying for. But what do you think? What should it take to restore the trust between citizens and institutions? Have you seen examples of this working in other places? I don't know. Share with us in the comments and let's kind of try to figure out this whole thing together. Thank you for watching up until this point. I hope it was as interesting for you to watch as it was for us to make. Check out one of these other videos and hopefully they'll be just as interesting as this one. Cheers.